Now, just making sure, can everybody hear me? Okay, good. Occasionally, this microphone system, and for those of you who are aware of our sanctuary space here at St. Matthew's, sometimes things act up, and we're not quite sure why. I had a funeral here on Wednesday, and I couldn't actually use this microphone because every time I turned it on, the feedback was incredible and very painful. So fortunately, my sound technician Lonnie, who's just didn't even need touching. Well, it must be your presence, Lonnie, of just making sure that it works. But one of the things with using tech, whenever doing presentations like this, you always have to be in my role. Whenever we use technology in the sanctuary, we affirm, at least from my perspective, God is present, but so is Murphy. And so you have to be ready for anything to go wrong. And I'm actually very fortunate to have both Lonnie here, but also Shannon McLennan-Taylor, who is actually handling the videotaping of this, so that if by chance you have to miss a given night, they will be available online. And that's a fairly new thing. We did that with the Early Christianity course, and it worked out well. And if you're interested, for those of you who weren't at the Early Christianity course, you can go to the St. Matthew's website. I'll explain how to do that later, and actually view all of the early Christianity. Anyway, but before I get too far, I wanted to ask Trish to say a few words on behalf of Call. So.
It's unrelated to the wonderful experience we're going to have over the next number of weeks, but I just wanted, in case anyone hadn't heard who is a member of Call, and anyone is welcome to come to this event, Call member or not, and that is on May 11th. We're having a spring dinner like we had last year, and it's at the Danish Community Club. It is a multi-course dinner, and the speakers this year are talking about their new book, The Naughty Nation, which should be interesting, John Braid and Sidney Sharp. So, in case anyone hasn't heard about this, and you can go on the Call website, that's the Calgary Association of Lifelong Learners, to see about how to get a ticket, not real tickets, but to register. All the information is there. So I just wanted to make sure that if there's anyone that hadn't heard about it, that you have now. And thank you, John, for letting me do that.
No worries, Trish. I wanted to go into a little bit of background. Now, I see a number of familiar faces, but how many of you, this is your first time here at St. Matthew's? Okay, so about a third. I think that's, I'm not sure, Dawn, you count, because you're very familiar with me, but it still works. But welcome to St. Matthew's United Church. This is the third lecture, seminar, whatever we call this, in partnership with the Calgary Association of Lifelong Learners. And part of this was originally made possible by one of a couple of our members, Brenda Fall and hi Brenda, and Wayne Velo, who have done seminars in the past. Wayne, for those of you who've seen the advertisement, he said he was going to try and be here tonight, but he may not be feeling well. He does Shakespeare, and I want to give him a plug because at 10 o'clock on Monday mornings, more or less concurrently with what we're doing here, he is doing Anthony and Cleopatra. And Wayne is he taught for many years at EP Scarlet, and it was his enthusiasm with this, but also his relationship with the Calgary Association of Lifelong Learners that made this possible. About a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, I offered a seminar on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and originally it was just going to be for the congregation, and it was actually Wayne and Brenda who said, why don't we open it up? And that meant we had to move from the conference room here into the sanctuary, and it's been pretty much that way ever since. And at the end of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I said, what would you like me to do next? And someone stuck up their hands and said, how about the Crusades? And I said, yes. The only thing is, in saying yes, I had to realize, okay, what have I gotten myself into? And so what ended up happening is we actually there was a part one, for those of you, and don't worry if you didn't take in the part one, was to do early Christianity, which more or less was from the time following the events of Jesus' life up to approximately the middle of the 11th century. And it was, again, a very broad overview in terms of that, in order to get us to the period that we now refer to as the Crusades. And so that was more or less the starting point. And don't worry if you weren't part of that. If you really want to get the details, of course, all the video stuff is online. But I hope to do a real crash course of at least the years leading up to the Crusades, and actually that's what much of tonight is. So anyway, maybe this is a dangerous question. How many of you have actually studied the Crusades in some way, shape, or form? Okay, we've got a couple of hands. Because I occasionally when talking about this, there are going to be little facts and things that I may miss, but I'm trying to get the broad themes, and sometimes my pronunciation of names is going to be horrible. But we'll work on it. Anyway, let's get started. I wanted to at least go over what we're going to be doing now. Because of certain events happening around mid-May, this seminar is actually going to be broken up into 2 3-week chunks. So this week, next week, and the week following is starting, of course, today, and today is the overall background. Oh, by the way, again, sorry. For those of you who aren't familiar with my style, if you have a question, there's not a bad time to ask it, and there's no such thing as a stupid question. So if you have a question about anything, please stick up your hand, and away we go. So, of course, today is just simply the background of what the Crusades were, the time period into which they happened, and just the whole, why did they happen in the first place? And the answer to that is actually a lot more complicated than we might think. But that is what today's conversation is about. Next week is simply talking about the First Crusade, which a lot of tonight will actually be doing the circumstances leading up to the First Crusade itself. And then, so that's next week, is the First Crusade. And then, appropriately enough, the Second Crusade happened roughly 50 years later. And then we take a 2-week break. The reason for that is that I had applied to do some study leave about roughly mid-May that would take me on to study leave. And then the week following would be Victoria Day. And I suspect people will be around the barbecues instead of here. I think that would be a good idea. So then we pick up again on May 29th with the Third Crusade. And then we talk about Fourth Crusade and beyond on the 5th week. And then the last week is actually Aftermath. Now, in truth, one of the big difficulties that we start talking about is how many Crusades were there. Because, numerically, once you get past 4, and even with each of these, there were little sub-crusades and little sub-battles, and various other campaigns. So even though these titles say First Crusade, Second Crusade, Third Crusade, and so on, really what we're going to be getting into is sort of a time period block. And these are only roughly approximate dates as to when they might have been. And I get into a little bit of how we define that a little bit later. But of course, on June 12th is the aftermath and legacy of the so-called Crusader period. And the kind of impact, and really in many respects, that we still actually have the impact of the Crusades happening today as well. So, here we go. Any questions before we start, by the way? Yes?
Why did you choose to call it
A dark history.
a dark history?
Yeah. I'm calling it a dark history, not the Dark Ages, because there's a subtle difference. The Dark Ages, the reason that it's called that is sort of that there's a certain mythology around it. It's a period of profound ignorance, which perhaps that might have been true for parts of Western Europe, but certainly in the East, in the various Islamic cultures, actually it was very much a golden age. The reason I call it a dark history is that some very horrible things happened. And not the least of which we get into next week, but something called the Rhineland Massacres that actually created in many respects, was almost the beginning of various events that would eventually lead to the Holocaust almost 1,000 years later. That's one of the reasons why I call it a dark history, is to say that there are some not nice things that we're going to be covering with this, and I think that's probably the best way to do that. Tonight isn't so much dark, and I have joked that to kind of get into the mindset of the period is that for those of you who are familiar with and fans of Monty Python, the Holy Grail, because of course the Holy Grail, I mean it's a play on the Arthurian legends, but the Arthurian legends themselves have some degree of connection, kind of, but not really, because they're legends, to the Crusader period. And there's just some aspects of that, of just a dark sense of humor might be required, because otherwise it's some of this is really horrible. So, basic question. We need to define what the Crusades are before we actually get into talking about the Crusades. And so, the basic historical definition is that they were a series of campaigns with the explicit set goal of reclaiming the Holy Land, specifically areas in and around Jerusalem, from what at the time was Islamic rule. That's the very basic definition, and it was sanctioned by the Latin or the Roman Church, specifically. There's your definition of what we're working with. Now, the term crusade, after this period, and as we move on, and that's when we get into aftermath and legacy, suddenly started being applied. As the years went on, about 2 centuries later, a crusade seemed to be applied to virtually any military campaign, no matter where it happened. And we get in, and we certainly get into that. But this is where we start. Any questions? And just fairly basic. And the period that we're actually dealing with in this course is from the 11th to the 13th century. But as I already alluded to, there were a number of different campaigns that, for example, there's something called the Albigensian Crusade that happened in the pretty much the 14th century, sort of 13th, 14th centuries, different that actually gained the name Crusade. But again, we get into that later. Specifically, the definition we're working with here is campaigns of Western forces moving to try and reclaim the Holy Land. And that's where we're working with. But how it got more painted with a broader brush, that comes later. Yes.
You mentioned that his weak name, was it within the realm of the Christian church before?
Yes and no. And the reason. Do I get into that now, or can you hold on to that question? And I'm going to try and remember to get it to it, because Depends on who you talk to and what perspective of history. But pre-Islam, there's a certain argument for yes. But with caveats. So, Shannon. Right. Sorry. Sorry, your name is? Maruf. Okay. Well, Maruf's question was, I used the term reclaim. And was it ever Christian in the first place? And that's a fantastic question. And my response to that was, well, yes and no. But I'll get into this. Certainly, in this period of time, the answer is no. Go back pre-Islam, the answer is maybe. So that's kind of what we want to. That's what we want to work with. Now, this is just a side note. Some will actually date the Crusader period going all the way up to 1492 with the conclusion of what was called the Reconquista. That's the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, is when the last of I'm really hesitant to use the term Muslim, but dominantly the forces or perceived occupiers from North Africa, who had really since almost for 700 years had occupied or really settled in Spain, and then there was a real push in this period to push that out. And there's no coincidence, really, that in 1492, when the Reconquista finished, that explorers began finding other places to conquer. But really, the period that we're mostly dealing with here is up until the end of the 13th century. So here's a bit of interesting trivia. And for those of you who are Harry Potter fans, you might actually recognize some of this. What does crusade actually mean? How many of you have taken Latin? Okay, for those of you who have taken Latin, you know this better than I do because I have not. I've taken Hebrew and I've taken Greek. Latin's not my strong point, so please, please, please correct me if I'm wrong. And please forgive me for my pronunciations. But the using the term cruciate is the actual, was apparently the written term. And it draws from a couple of different roots. The root words are crux, meaning cross, and crucio. But crucio. Now, for those of you who are Harry Potter fans, where have you heard crucio before? I'm looking at you, Shannon.
Not exactly Harry Potter fan, but I'm familiar. It's not a pretty nasty spell?
It's a very nasty spell. So again, crux roughly means cross. Crucio means torture. And crucifix actually means to torture by fixing someone to something. So when you hear the word crucifix, namely, this is very uncharacteristic for United Church, but we do actually have something that if you combine that image with that image, you actually get what is referred to as a crucifix. But crucifixion actually means death or torture by fixing someone, usually by nails, to an object. But there's also a play, it's quite often done so on a cross, hence crux. So curiously enough, even though the idea of crusade the idea was that it was called a crusade or a cruciate, that someone would, like they wouldn't actually call it torture. But the idea of taking up one's cross and bearing it to Jerusalem is how it was described. But the linguistic origins of it really, the irony of it was really striking. So it does. The idea is one would take up one's cross and carry it to Jerusalem. And so that's your working definition. However, Yeah, and the thing is, primarily what we were working with here is the idea is that one would take up one's cross. It became perceived as an act of piety, and I do actually get into that. And so that term would certainly be retroactively applied. But the idea of taking up one's cross as a pilgrimage, or the idea, was certainly infused into it. But anyway, here's sort of this is sort of the primary cause, if you can actually name it that, is that there was a call for help from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who sent a delegation to Rome to say, hey, we need some help against a threat. Can you help us? And Pope Urban, and the threat in this case was actually, it was the Seljuk Empire, or more specifically, it was actually a sub-state of the Seljuk Empire, or called the Sultanate, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome, namely the Seljuk Turks that were ruling what is now modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, and Alexios was in process of trying to reclaim these lands that were once part of the Byzantine Empire. And he wanted some help. So he said, hey, can you help us? And sent a delegation. And Pope Urban, the reason they came to the Pope is because the Pope was, like Rome, basically was the central communications hub of Western Europe. Most of the time, the nations in Western Europe were fighting with each other, and they really didn't talk. It's kind of like, well, I need some. Alexios I said, well, I'd like to hire some mercenaries, and well, I need access to that. Well, who do I know out there? Well, the pontiff in Rome was probably a good place to start. And Urban had his own ambitions, and said, sure, we'll help him. And the thing, you're going to have to wait till the end of the night as to what all those ambitions were. I might touch on them a little bit. But in essence, what he did is he said, okay, well, anybody who goes and helps out with this, part of the sales package was anybody who takes on this will receive indulgences for having gone. Now, indulgences are kind of a complicated thing. How many of you are familiar with, you're probably familiar with the term indulgences from history, but how many of you actually know what an indulgence actually is?
Is it when they paid the priest and said, you know, God will forgive my sins, for these are my sins, if I pay you, I'll get forgiven, and, you know, sort of, is that kind of what it is?
Yeah, well, now for those of you who are from a Roman Catholic background, you may actually know this better than I do. But in essence, an indulgence was basically doing an act of piety, and then somebody would pray for you in order for your soul to be spend less time in purgatory, which wasn't exactly hell, and it's certainly not heaven. This kind of holding period where you're kind of purged of your venial sins. I think that would be the best way to put it. And like I said, the trouble is that to explain it here, I could spend an entire night on indulgences themselves. It actually it became a very complicated process of system of penance, specifically within the Latin or the Roman Church. You didn't find indulgences in what became the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Coptic Church at all. This was something that developed out of the Latin Church. But by the time of the First Crusade, effectively it was a get out of hell free card. If you want to just think about it like that, Anybody who goes on this crusade gets an indulgence that's a get out of hell free card. Great! Because normally what it would be is an indulgence was usually given that somebody who was more pious than you would pray on your behalf in exchange for an act of piety. Usually the act of piety would be a pilgrimage, perhaps a gift, perhaps doing an act of charity, that kind of thing. Eventually, we get to Peggy. Eventually, it gets to money. Now, like, I'll just pay you and you can pray for me. But at this point in time, that hadn't happened yet. But the abuse of indulgences, which eventually led to the Reformation, had to do with the whole thing here. Let me just buy my ticket out of hell. But, eventually, of course, for money. But the idea is, if you just kind of get in your mind, this is a gross oversimplification, but effectively is, anybody who goes on this gets a get out of hell free card. And that was a pretty good incentive. Now here's the thing. Prior to this, Christians certainly did engage in warfare, but it was not seen as a holy act at all. In fact, in his work, The City of God, which St. Augustine wrote, and this was actually in response to the Visigoths' sacking of Rome, is it appropriate for Christians to defend themselves in combat? And St. Augustine said, yes, but you still have to pay, there are certain moral consequences of killing people, for example, and it doesn't absolve your actions for it. And so certainly this was the model for this period of time. Now, here's just a little bit of math. There is we are closer to the Crusades in terms of the time distance between us and the Crusades than from the Crusades to the ministry of Jesus. So as long ago as this was, we are actually closer to this than this was to Jesus. So up until this point in time, pacifism was the ideal. Defend yourself if you must, but you're still liable for what you do. Funny. Well, it was a little more complicated than that. I mean, you would have to do penance for your actions, but it certainly was not seen as a holy act, because the idea is that there were the fairly complex system of penance and like if you went to war, you did penance for it later. The idea of it. Again, gross oversimplification. Some of this is going to be like at an orbital level. This is the way that I like to talk about this, is that a lot of these points are PhDs all by themselves. And this is just trying to get a broad overview. So there are some specifics I certainly won't be able to get into. But that's broad category. So here's the thing. At this point in time, when Urban II suddenly said, now going to war now becomes an act of piety, all of a sudden now going into combat becomes an act of piety in and of itself, rather than doing a pilgrimage or helping with the poor. Killing people was now seen as an act of piety because of this offering indulgences to anybody who went on crusade. Yuck. But that's what happened. And so this is the kind of the mindset with this. So actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Were the Crusades holy wars? And holy war is in itself a paradox, but The answer to that is, well, yes and no. A lot of the things I like to answer both. Yes and no, but really, no. But unfortunately, religion gets blamed for a lot. Now, religion is responsible for a lot. I'm not, because I'm saying dark history here, we have to make sure that we don't underplay the role of religion here, but at the same time, I don't want to overplay it. Here's the yes. In essence, in offering divine favor to anybody who goes on crusade, this is clearly, it provides an impetus for people to go. And it is a religious motivation. So there's your yes. But the thing is, the history, the causes leading up to it, the actual circumstances of what the Crusades were supposed to be about, because there's what Pope Urban told the people in general what the Crusades were about, and what they were really about, are two different things. This was really, it was more about territory, economics, political power. And name any war in history, you're going to find territory, political power, economics are your drivers for war. Religion becomes simply a motivator. Now, keep in mind, Western Europe was a highly superstitious population, generally. There were some exceptions, but for the most part, when you have a highly superstitious population and tell them, here, do this, you'll get a get out of hell free card, it goes well. So, and the thing is, if this were truly a holy war, see this point down here, if this were truly a holy war, why did the Crusades not break out as early as the middle of the 7th century, when Islam was making its huge advances? Why did the Crusades happen then? Because if it was truly a holy war, that's when it should have happened, but it didn't. And the thing is, Christians did actually live in relative peace underneath Islamic rule for a lot of us, and I get into a little bit more. So the whole thing is, what changed? What were the circumstances that suddenly led that at the very end of the 11th century to this actually happening? Now that map doesn't mean anything. This is just a broad category. I don't like this particular map. Fortunately, I've got some better ones. But this more or less shows the broader. But on the next page, I much prefer this map. So this is about what Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean looked like, and actually right through North Africa, in terms of what things looked like. It's okay. Cell phones. The reality is, I have my cell phone in my pocket, and for whatever reason, it's buzzing me about Twitter. So, yeah. Shannon manages our Twitter account, and anytime that there's a new log on, so I really ought to do this. So if it starts buzzing over there, it's. But anyway, so this is more or less what Europe looked like. The trouble is that territorial boundaries kept changing, and so they were really hard to nail down. And I was trying to get a good map. This is an okay map. Just to give you sort of your broad idea, there's the papal states there. So Rome is there. You have much of Italy. You have the Kingdom of Venice here, Burgundy, the Holy Roman Empire, France. And look at that, 1095, thanks to somebody by the name of William the Conqueror, much of England is under Norman control. But here's the interesting thing. Italy is also under Norman control down here. We get to that, because that plays a part of that. But then we have the Byzantine Empire here. Now, the Byzantine Empire is really the major player in terms of the actual political entity that made the request, that made the Crusades possible, even though it was sanctioned by the Latin Church. The Byzantine Empire, and the trouble is, if you went to into the Byzantine Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, you would hear about the glories of the Roman Empire. Because the Byzantine Empire is actually as the Roman Empire evolved in various ways, the Byzantine Empire is the continuation of the Roman Empire right on through until it is finally completely wiped out by the Ottoman Turks in about the 15th century-ish. But so the Byzantine Empire itself is self-perceives itself to be the continuation of the original Roman Empire going back at this point. The Roman Empire by this point is over 1,000 years old, and so we have the Byzantine Empire, and then over here we have. Where unfortunately, this is a little dark for you to see it, but it's called the Seljuk states, and it's really, this is under the current, at least at the time, and we get into how this happened, is under the rule of Seljuk Turks, primarily, but they are at this point in time, anything in and around here is largely under various states whose religious affiliation is dominantly Islam. Except for Armenia. Except for these guys right here. Because they are of a Christian Eastern Orthodox tradition. So there is that part there. There were a lot of different things going on, a lot of different realignments, and of course, one of the big ones was of course the successful invasion of England. But what happened in Western Europe is that it had actually largely stabilized. But of course, for those of you who were here for the early Christianity course, is that in 1054, so 41 years before this. Well, about 41 years before this, there was a major split between the Roman Church, or the church centered in Rome, and the church centered in Constantinople. And Constantinople, of course, is the capital of the Byzantine Empire right here. And the reality is that over time, there were originally 5 centers of the church. And this is where we get Maruf, I'm just making sure that we get to your question, is that the church for many years actually had 5 major centers. And in no particular order were Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria in modern day Egypt. Okay. But as time went on, the influence of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria kind of faded from the scene, and some of that had to do with politics. Some of it actually had to do with the rise of Islam.
The church in Ethiopia, where does that fit in?
The church in Ethiopia. Well, Ethiopia is about there. And the church in Ethiopia was largely you probably heard, unfortunately, due to bombings in Egypt, the Coptic church. And so the church in Ethiopia was largely Coptic Christian. And you see, you had this, like most people talk about, the big split in the church was, unfortunately in the West, we're arrogant enough to think that the big split in the church was what happened in the Reformation, where the Protestants split from the Roman Catholics. No. And for the most part, we talk about the Great Schism being the split between the Roman Church and the Church in Constantinople. The thing is, at least 500 years before that, there was actually a genuine split between the church centered in Alexandria and the rest of and the church centered on the northern shores of Constantinople, and that evolved into what we now call the Coptic Church. And so, going back to your question, Ruth, when you were asking, was Jerusalem ever actually under Christian control? There was a church in Jerusalem, and at a time when the Roman Empire did include Jerusalem, at a time when Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. So, in that sense, that's where the yes comes in. The difficulty is certainly by this time, and that Jerusalem had not been a center. You know, it certainly was long since regarded a holy city and continued to be, but as an actual influential center with people providing those ideas, really ever since the rise of Islam and Jerusalem coming under the control of the various caliphates that were there, it ceased to be so.
My understanding is that in the early days of Islam, people prayed towards Jerusalem before Mecca was repossessed by Muhammad.
Interesting.
And there is a mosque in Saudi Arabia, which is called, I don't know whether you understand Arabic or not, but it's called Masjid al-Qiblatain, which means that it is the mosque which is facing the Qibla, which means this is the holy place.
Right.
So before people started praying towards Mecca, they used to pray towards Jerusalem.
I remember reading on something. Now I can't. I'm going to let that stand. I think you're I'm not going to dispute that at all, because I think there is some validity to that. The difficulty, of course, is if we were to do something in terms of the history of Islam, I would want to bring someone who is much more versed at that than I am. But I think that there is certainly value to that. I mean, I am going to cover a bit of Islam. Well, I have to tonight. It doesn't make any sense if I don't. So anyway, the big thing is, 41 years before the Crusades happened, there was this major split between the Eastern and Western Church. And of course, as I mentioned before, England had been successfully invaded for really what is considered to be the last time, in 1066, and it marked the end of the Viking Age. And so what you actually had was, even though these nations constantly fought amongst themselves, it was a time of relative stability amongst a group of very warlike people. They liked to fight, and without a chance to fight something, they were looking for a fight. They were. In fact, there's a reason why, you think, okay, Normans are here. This is Normandy. Then what the heck is Norman Italy doing down here? We get to that. We have such, a history of Normans being noble. It's kind of like, no, Normans were real, forgive the expression, a real pain in the ass at this time. We'll get to that in a bit. Now, because of the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the Visigoths, the Latin Church found itself, whether it wanted to or not, suddenly in a position where they were not subject to the power of an empire, but rather found themselves actually having influence over multiple kingdoms. They didn't become, but they were able to sanction and say who went where. And for example, with Charlemagne in 800, that set a precedent that anybody who wanted to rule basically from here over needed to have sanction from Rome. And that was very important. That meant that Rome had a great deal of political power. Now, the other thing is that the papacy's history is just rife with corruption. Absolutely rife with it. And a lot of it was representative of, families infighting with each other. We got into this, of course, in the time of, because when you have a body that has an enormous amount of political power, but from a very small area, whoever controlled the papacy effectively was able to exert influence over large chunks of Europe. And there was a reform movement called the Cluniac Reforms, and that was based roughly out of an area called Cluny in France, where effectively it was a religious revival. That's how it started anyway. Eventually it unfortunately fell again to the well-moneyed. But the Cluniac Reforms at the time were a reclamation of piety, of interest in spiritual matters. And a lot of that actually included things like pilgrimages, which meant that some people started saying going on pilgrimages to Jerusalem and back. But that was part of it. There was this real explosion of interest in religious matters. I think that's putting it a little euphemistically. But the papacy did emerge from this. It hadn't quite cleared it by the time of Urban II. In fact, it didn't really quite clear it, depending on your perspective, ever. But at the same time, compared to what it was certainly a lot better than it was. And I've already mentioned this last point, that the interest in religious affairs was much more evident in the broad population in Western Europe. On the other hand, we move east, and what happened, the thing is, religious fervor amongst Christians in the Byzantine Empire wasn't anywhere the same degree as it was in Western Europe. I mean, yes, they were by and large Christian, but because the church in Constantinople was subject to the whims of the emperor, you had a much different relationship. And so, if anything, the politics there were far more, well, you've probably heard the term Byzantine politics, where you get into intrigue after intrigue after intrigue and layers of intrigue over top of that. There's a reason it's called Byzantine. Politics was the sport, really, in many respects, and that kind of intrigue was part of it. And not just there was a lot internally, but because they were on much more frontiers, diplomacy was something that the Byzantines were actually very good at, mostly. Occasional miscalculations, but the trouble is, if they miscalculated, the results were actually quite disastrous. And we do actually get to that. Yes?
It would be interesting to compare the qualities of Cicero to what was going on in Byzantine at that time.
I think it would. I think it would be. His question was, it's more Roe's statement is more of, it would be interesting to compare the politics of Cicero to what was going on in the Byzantine Empire. I think there's a PhD right there. In and of itself, I think very much worth it. Now, just to give you an idea of the extent of the Byzantine Empire, like you see this block here, which is largely what is now modern-day Greece, but you see little pockets here, and on Crimea and Cyprus. All of this was still under Byzantine control. So it did actually have a fair reach. Now, the thing is, the Byzantine Empire reached its largest, which basically controlled from here to here under Justinian in 555. Now, you can see how much territory it had lost by then. But of course, with that, like there was pressures from all sides, and so the Byzantine Empire began to fade. Now, this is not the smallest extent that the Byzantine Empire had. Like there was a point in time where there were just like bits and pieces of territory scattered all over around the Black Sea and a little bit in and around Greece, and that was. It got bigger, it got smaller, but it never ever reclaimed what it was under Justinian. In 1095, like this is a bit of an exaggeration. I like this point here. A new threat emerged. Well, the new threat didn't exactly emerge, but that's a gross oversimplification. In fact, it was actually Alex the First, or Alexios the First. Painted it as a threat. But it was more along the lines of, I want to get some territory back. So that'd be a better way to put it. And that's when he made the appeal to the West for help. But we gotta actually rewind this. And the rise of Islam. Now this is again gross oversimplification, and trying to make sure that I kind of cover all the bases in terms of the broader periods, and we did cover this in early Christianity as well. And as just the basics, it was a new religious movement, of course, emerged out of the Arabian Peninsula in and around 623 CE, Common Era. And of course centered around the teaching and leadership of the Prophet Muhammad. And of course, similar to Christianity, similar to Judaism, that it was radically monotheistic. There is only one God, which was, of course, shared with Christianity and Judaism. And in fact, when you look at the major world religions, you have sometimes we refer to as Christianity, Islam, Judaism as being Abrahamic faiths. Perhaps it's a better way to describe it as they're God-centered faiths, as opposed to the ones that are centered out of India, which are liberation-centered, and that's primarily Hinduism and Buddhism, to a lesser extent Jainism and a few others. But really God-centered religions. And and Zoroastrians, of course, I touch on them a little bit, because Zoroastrian influence on Christianity is actually a lot larger than most people realize. But the idea is that now, here's the thing. Islam, submission to God, someone who is Muslim is one who submits to God. These terms were not terms that people in Europe used. The terms were much more pejorative. The term largely sometimes used was sometimes the Turks, sometimes Saracens, and others. But this new religious tradition, of course, understood itself as submission to God. And Muhammad was able to unite previously polytheistic Arabic tribes and move out of the peninsula into political vacuums that had already been created. They basically stepped into a huge political vacuum. Namely, the Byzantine Empire had been fighting with the Sassanid Empire with Persians. And that particular area, they had burnt themselves out fighting each other, that when the unified Arab tribes moved out of the peninsula, they just simply were able to walk in without too much resistance at all. And in fact, the local populations were so tired of fighting, they welcomed them. This is just picking up that point. So this is the different stages here, and unfortunately on this screen we lose some of it. Can everybody see that there's a total difference in terms of color between here and here. Okay, you can see that? Okay, good. I'm not worried about reading it too much, this is the area initially under Muhammad specifically that the control the Arab tribes, the unified Arab tribes, were able to conquer and basically move into. And then under the successor caliphates. Caliphate means steward, by the way. In other words, being stewards for what the Prophet had set up. But to give you an idea of rapid expansion, it's basically from 622 over a period of 10 years, just 10 years, from 622 to 632. The unified Arab tribes under Muhammad managed to claim the entire Arabian Peninsula and unify it. And then from there, eventually they moved out and stepped into the vacuum left vacant by the Byzantine and the Sassanids. The Sassanids were here, the Byzantines were here, and they just walked into territory that two empires had basically exhausted, and they completely subsumed the entirety of the Persian Empire. Completely. And were able to maintain control of that. And then that was the next 30 years, which was this area here. And then they expanded from really the next 90 years, expanded out into here and expanded west. And in the so-called age of the under what is called the Umayyad Caliphate. And that was the big expansion, but largely the expansion came not because they were stepping into vacuum and unoccupied areas. And you notice that almost the entire Iberian Peninsula, what is now modern-day Spain, they expanded into. And they expanded here. But notice here, this is the border of the Byzantine Empire. And this border held. Okay? Because the Byzantines had largely exhausted their resources down in this area. And this, by the way, Jerusalem is there, Alexandria is there, Antioch is there. So those are the three other centers of Christian thought. Very quickly came under Islamic control, and then Constantinople and Rome were over here. This expansion, by the middle of the 8th century, this is more or less the territory that came under Islamic control, specifically under the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, for the most part, the Umayyads themselves were they were certainly an occupying force, but for the most part, they were very much welcomed because they actually brought in an economic system of lower taxes. They were actually very skilled merchants, among other things, and they were quite welcome because they were so tired of the fighting that was going on over here. But there were certain places where there were attempts to get in and knock out the Byzantine Empire that were not successful. I'm seeing a hand from Lonnie.
This expansion, is this all military, or is it general population?
The trouble is just it's better to represent it as political control, of which military is part of it. But it's more and more along the lines of these territories agreed to be under. Usually a lot of it was diplomacy, and now sometimes there's a certain amount of more than agreement, but at the same time, the consequences of not agreeing might bring down the wrath of a very large army. So, put it this way. To quote Clausewitz, war is simply diplomacy by another means. And if they were looking at expanding control, and certainly there was an enthusiasm of, because for the most part, the Arab tribes themselves had actually been under control of other empires, and when it was their turn and stepping into a vacuum, they were curious as to how far they could go.
How many people would this affect? So, in terms of large groupings of people, are we talking millions?
Well, certainly in the millions. The population of this area, inclusive of Europe, probably would have been at the time maybe as many as 200 million people. Now, in terms of the population of the Islamic Caliphate itself, might have been as many as 75 million or so. But I'm, without exaggeration, just pulling that completely out of the air.
I guess there were three main centers
Yes.
of the caliphates.
Yes.
One was in Damascus, which was under the Umayyads.
Yep, the Umayyads.
Then there was the Abbasids under, which was in Baghdad.
Yep.
And then the third one was in Cairo, in the Fatimids.
Yes. And I do get to all three of them.
These were the three main centers.
Yes.
I guess the total population at that time would be somewhere close to about 100, close to around 100 million.
So my 75 isn't that far off.
But also, I think that, in answer to your question, the Arabs did not physically go and occupy the land. The original people there continued to live there, have their own administration and government and so on and so forth. But the representative of the caliph was based in strategic, large population centers representing the caliph.
Yes.
But they didn't have an army or anything like that of occupation.
Yeah, and that becomes more just in terms of army and occupation. That basically local regional powers had control, and basically it was in essence. The thing is, using a feudal term is wrong because of course that was entirely Europe. But basically, it's swearing a certain degree of fealty to the caliph.
So like
Crude, but analogous with a lot of caveats, perhaps, I think would be. Well, you see, colonialism as a concept really didn't evolve until after this period. But empires from time out of mind did expand and contract and expand and contract. And the biggest thing was, especially in a time where your fastest communication was horse, is how do you administer such a large area? And by letting people control their own destinies locally, as long as there was a certain degree of loyalty, that was the way control was maintained. So as a result, and I will get to this at a point. Generally, those, particularly Christians and those who were Christians and Jews under Islam during this period, lived in relative peace and were actually given protection. They weren't so keen on various polytheistic faiths, on the other hand. But then again, Christians weren't either. We actually get to that because let's see, where am I here? So as I noted, that there wasn't a lot of expansion into Asia Minor, but do notice that by the time we get to 1085, that all of Asia Minor is under control of the Seljuk Turks, which was religiously Islamic. Basically, the attempt to try and take anything was, there was a siege of Constantinople in 718 that was launched. The idea was, let's cut off the head of the snake, was the perspective of those attacking it. But it didn't work. And so the Umayyads decided that moving across northern Africa and moving further east was a much more profitable way of going. And besides, one could control trade routes, because keep in mind, economics here, trade routes. But the Byzantine Empire was largely to hold most of Asia Minor at the time. But like I said, most of this was economic. I mean, there was a certain degree of religious fervor in terms of spreading the message of the prophet. But it was in terms of, as with any sort of territorial expansion and control, is to be able to say, you know, the trade routes, and that was a large trade routes and resources was a lot of this. Now the other things, of course. Despite how it may have been perceived in the West, of course, Islam was actually much more divided. Because of course there were all kinds of civil wars. Sorry, occasionally this microphone cuts out. There were civil wars, and again, any one of these, there's all kinds of history we can get into in terms of the internal conflicts as to how external power, like generally when an empire or a large, they were fighting amongst themselves, that was external weakness, and that did happen. It did actually happen quite a bit. And of course, one of the big examples that, at least in the West, we're a little bit more familiar with is the split between Shia and Sunni Islam. Now, again, that's a whole course in and of itself. But in and around 750, the Umayyad Caliphate was overthrown by what became known as the Abbasid Caliphate. In essence, it's basically who controlled, who controlled the office of a caliph. And it was, quite typical when revolutions happen is groups that feel that they don't have a voice, they revolt and set up their own system. And this is when, of course, the capital is moved to Baghdad, and the focus became more towards the east. So there wasn't a lot of interest in moving into Asia Minor at that point in time. And in terms of overall control, like we have, here's the thing, is if you go onto Wikipedia and type in Abbasid Caliphate and look at the control, that's a lot of territory. And yet there are a whole bunch of sub-empires within that all claim to be under Abbasid rule. But again, this was probably, using Canada to Great Britain, it was probably more along the lines of federation, really. Commonwealth actually would be a reasonable term. So I see a question.
I'm not familiar with the word Abbasid. Is that the name of a group of people?
It's Abbasid dynasty would be the better way to put it.
It's like the name of a tribe or a group?
They take, Maruf, you may be able to help me here. They take the name. They take the name from a certain.
Area?
No, not a certain area. Certain original followers of Muhammad.
Abbas was one of the great grandsons of the Prophet.
Thank you.
And during the time of Karbala, which is now present-day Iraq, when the schism happened between or after that, it is really to do with the succession, the political succession after Muhammad, and which was
Of course, the name of the person.
Yeah, so even though this was many, many years later, it takes the name of the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. That's to indicate what kind of rule that they had hoped.
Show legitimacy.
Yes, I mean, and you're right. Even though none of them may have actually been related to us directly, by using the name, it created that sense of legitimacy. Any political power, no matter what religious affiliation they have, needs a certain amount of legitimacy. And that, in the West, that was especially true. Remember, since 800, no emperor or no king in the West was able to ascend to the throne without the Pope's approval, because that was the vehicle of legitimacy. So, in sort of a similar way with the Abbasids, taking the name of us, that was the way in which the legitimacy was put into place. But the reality was it was far more fragmented, and in many respects, it ebbed and flowed. And I get to this point at one of these points. We'll actually say that. That in many respects, the Caliph became more of a figurehead, really, than actually exerting genuine physical control. And by this time, like the Abbasids, the rulers themselves, were mostly Arabic. But the various peoples that were under this were, of course, Persians, Slavs, Turks, Berbers, and many other ethnicities that were under them. But of course, religiously, many of them were not Islamic initially. And when specifically non-Muslim, probably, and they weren't Christian or Jewish either. Maybe some may have been, well, certainly in the area, Zoroastrian and among others, but there were different groups. But you had a large and very diverse group, and so you.
Especially in Central Asia.
Yes.
There were a lot of other religions.
Well, because of course in Central Asia they're in contact with both with Hinduism and of course and Buddhism, and the mixing of ideas, of course, would lead to the emergence of new traditions, including Sikhism, eventually. So after this, the one thing here, this is just more of a note, is that while up until this point, largely the caliphs were of Arabic descent, that ceased to be the case in 860. Which is interesting, considering that the popes in Rome were almost exclusively Italian up until this century. They were a little ahead of us, a little ahead of the West in that regard. Okay, no, I'm just making sure. Oops. A lot of this we've already talked about this, but there was a large decentralization, and again, this point I've already made. But curiously enough, a lot of the control eventually fell under Turkish tribes who really liked Persian culture. And that was, again, it was largely centered out of the two main dynasties at this point were the Buyids, who were, and I'm not pronouncing that right, I know, who were Persian, and then of course the Seljuk and the Seljuk Turks, and this is the one that we really need to pay most attention to, at least for the purposes of the Crusades. So, the trouble is, again, finding good maps at the right time that I need is difficult. Wait till I talk about maps next week, about how bad the maps in Europe were. honestly, it's worth a laugh. This one largely shows, this is still technically, all of this is still under the, considered as part of the Abbasid dynasty. But really, by the time that there was control, we had the Persians with the Buyid Emirate, and then you had a number of smaller ones, and then the Fatimids, and of course, and I'm not pronouncing that right now. Yeah, Fatimids. Okay, and of course they were centered out of Cairo, and so the Emirate of Mosul, the Kingdom of Armenia, and then the Byzantine Empire. Now, so you had a lot of this. So this was still all under Islam, but again, you had these different fragmented states. But then, particularly in this case, now this is not, please don't interpret this as these were suddenly Genghis Khan, the next taking over the world. No, this just happened to be, this is the empire. The Seljuk Turks are the ones that we have to pay attention to, specifically in relation to the Crusades. Although we do have to talk about the Fatimids as well, but less so. But because, of course, the Seljuk Empire, what became the Seljuk Empire, controlled the territory right on the border of, right on the eastern border of the Byzantine Empire. Now, just a bit of a background is that the Seljuks were Turkish in origin, or Turkic, I think. The trouble is, we think of modern-day Turkey as being in, like, what is Asia Minor. The reality is that the Turks actually occupied, or occupied isn't the right word, because they originated from the areas east of the Caspian Sea. And so the Turks aren't originally from what we now call Turkey. Make sense? As clear as mud? So east of the Caspian Sea, and they really liked Persian culture, and they adopted Islam. And eventually they gained through just being participants in the same way in the West that the Goths and Visigoths eventually became Christianized and themselves becoming part of various kingdoms. The Oghuz Turks eventually adopted they adopted the dominant religion. They adopted somebody else's culture, but in so doing, gained political influence and control. Does anybody still need that slide? Okay. By the way, if I'm going too fast, say slow down. Now, as the Seljuk Turks they had managed to largely gain control of the area in and around Baghdad, as well as east of Asia Minor, much of what is now modern day Iraq and Iran. And in 1068, they invaded the Byzantine Empire. But here's the thing, they didn't actually want to invade the Byzantine Empire, because they were actually in process of fighting the Fatimids, based out of Cairo. In other words, you have inside the Abbasid Empire, you have two empires who are actually fighting with each other. So again, not monolithic, and the idea is if they invaded the East, if they invaded Asia Minor, that would give them some territorial advantages in order to be able to move on the Fatimids. It was purely a strategic move. So again, even though, They invade the Byzantine Empire, but it's not because they want the territory of Asia Minor because they want that territory. No, they want control all the way down to Cairo. So stabilize the border, that way we're free to be able to move down against the people that we really consider our opponents. In other words, we're going to move on the Christians so we can actually take out other Muslims. That's a gross oversimplification, really. But the thing is, that doesn't seem... When you're talking in terms of if this was, again, a purely religious war, or the religion was motivating it, it doesn't make any sense. But the thing is, the invasions of the Byzantines at the time were too strong. And so it's like, okay, well, we better... Let's just make a peace agreement. So they actually did. They actually made a peace agreement with the Byzantine emperor at the time, and that peace agreement allowed them to say, okay, now we can move on the Fatimids. So they achieved their strategic goal, even though they didn't get the territory they wanted. They still got that strategic goal. And so Alp Arslan, who was the leader at the time, now that's a nickname. Means lion. You ever wonder where C.S. Lewis got Aslan? So that's just a little side. And then we have, getting into Byzantine politics, now we have something called the Battle of Manzikert. And this is really the climax of tonight. Because it was this that in essence created the circumstance in which the Crusades would eventually happen. Notice we haven't touched the Crusades at all. But if it wasn't for the Battle of Manzikert, now how many of you have actually heard of Manzikert? But the thing is, this was a very, very important battle. Because, of course, what was happening is that the border between the Seljuk Turks and the Byzantine Empire was very much in flux. And I mean, those border wars being fought in and around the 1068 on through 1071 were trying to establish what those borders were. Of course, Romanos IV, the Byzantine emperor at the time, wanted to get back a lot of those contested territories. So, remember, I was talking about Byzantine plots. Make a peace treaty with Alp Arslan to basically extend the peace treaty that he established. But really, we're going to go and occupy the fortresses in the land and reclaim the territory anyway. In other words, they basically, Romanos IV basically bald-faced lied, said, we want a peace treaty, and then proceeded to reclaim a lot of the territory, while Arslan, who really didn't want anything to do with the Byzantines, really, because he wanted to deal with the Fatimids. And instead, he started, Romanos IV started moving into various parts of Turkey. Now, there's an understatement. And so, when they realized what the Byzantines were actually doing, they at the time, Alp Arslan and his forces were in Aleppo. Which of course is now in modern-day Syria. But they were in Aleppo, and they decided, okay, no, this can't stand. We've got to move back up and intercept this. And because of course, because Romanos IV he actually went into the field himself to lead the army. The trouble is that typical of emperors at the time is that he had a huge entourage. And he brought all of his toys with him. And those who he was with, put it this way, it was very obvious, where is the emperor? Well, he's the one in the middle of all that rich over there. But he did actually take to the field. He did want to lead it, but he brought an enormous entourage. And was moving, and he did actually want to confront the Turks and end this once and for all. And he had been emboldened by the fact that the Turks were not able to actually make any sort of gains, saying, okay, our army is stronger. You know, I have better military forces than the Turks do. So here's the basic group. Is, of course, Romanos was moving through this way, claiming various fortresses along the way. And when Alp-Arslan got wind of it, he moved up here. For various reasons, this is actually, in terms of transport trade route, Manzikert, which has a different name today, and of course I'm blanking out on the name, but it's in what is now eastern Turkey. Malzikert, I think, is the actual, what it's actually called today. But, you know, as they're making the way, they come back up here and intercept. Now, anybody familiar with the term order of battle? Order of battle is more or less what the forces are made up of and how many people there are. Now, this is a broad order of battle. I can't tell you exactly in terms of how many have cavalry or archers or foot soldiers they had, but in terms of broad numbers, and of course this being as long ago as it was, there's disputed accounts. So there's estimates anywhere from 40,000 to 70,000 troops that he had. 10,000 of them were actual Byzantine professional soldiers. And this was the core of his force. Now, there were also Frankish and Norman mercenaries, people from Western Europe in this. And they were under the control of Russell de Bayeux. Like I said, my pronunciations are going to kill me. I sat there several minutes trying to listen to that. And the thing is, my wife and daughter are both in, my wife is fluently, speaks French fluently, and my daughter's in French immersion. And I hope I got Bayeux right. But anyway, that's how I'm going to pronounce it. And for those of you who speak French, you can come and correct me afterwards. There was also the Varangian Guard. Now, the Varangian Guard themselves were actually specifically were elite troops directly under that were guards specifically of the emperor. But interestingly enough, they also had mercenaries who were Turks. Does anybody see a bad thing happening? Okay. Okay, now just making sure I'm getting there. There are also troops from Georgia. There were also troops from Armenia, and the Armenian troops here were the ones in you know that more or less in that northeastern corner of the Mediterranean. You also had troops from Antioch, under the control of the Duke of Antioch. So the various commanders. There's Romanos IV himself. And unfortunately, some of these Greek names I'm not capable of pronouncing. Joseph. My apologies to anybody who is of Greek descent, please. As I said, I read Greek and Hebrew. I do not pronounce Greek. I can pronounce a bit of Hebrew. Now, Joseph was actually Romanos IV. He was his primary general. But then there was also Andronicus Ducas, who was an unusual choice. He was also one of the generals, but he was the son of a rival to Romanos IV. Anybody getting more bad vibes? And then you have the Duke of Antioch, whose name, unfortunately, I was not able to actually uncover. And then, of course, you had Russell de Bayou. He comes back a couple of times. That's why I had to practice pronouncing his name. On the other side, notice here, on this side, we have 40 to 70,000. On the side of the Seljuk Turks, anywhere from 20 to 30,000. Now, one of the things, whenever I do military history, always estimate low. If you because the numbers tend to be exaggerated. So, really, if you want, even though the numbers are broadly kind of lean towards the lower number, but even if you lean lower, the Byzantine forces effectively outnumber the Turks 2-1 at least. They were based out of, they were troops from Aleppo, Mosul, and the primary commander was, of course, Alpsar Arslan, who was the current Sultan of the Seljuk Empire. And that's it. Now, granted, there were other sub-commanders that we do have names for, but again, we're not getting too much into detail here. So the actual Battle of Manzikert occurred on August 26th, 1071. Julian calendar. And of course, things did not go well for Romanos IV. Partly, it had to do with both a failure of intelligence, in other words, knowing one thing when it comes to warfare, knowing where your opponent is a really good idea. If you don't know where your opponent is, that's bad. And generally, particularly when it came to this, not only that you need to know where your opponent is, but also you need to make sure your troops are going to do what you ask them to do. So, initially, Romanos IV didn't think that Arslan was actually going to be at Manzikert. He thought he'd be able to occupy it fairly quickly, because, of course, his deception, in theory, had worked. But it hadn't. Is that basically he took one half of the forces under Joseph to take Kiliat, and the idea was to cut off enemy reinforcements, and he would then go and take Manzikert. That was the broad strategic plan. Trouble is, remember that bad idea I first pointed out? Well, virtually as soon as they came in contact, now, battles like this, they did actually have what were called embassies. In other words, envoys that went across and said, well, here are my terms, here are your terms. And Alpsar said, well, you know what, if you give me these cities, you know, we'll just call it a day, we won't fight. And of course, Romanos IV felt that he had numerical superiority. No, we're going to fight. He was looking for a conclusive defeat in the field. He wanted to beat the Seljuks. Arslan, on the other hand, really didn't want this fight. But curiously enough, when you have a group of Turkic mercenaries meet their brothers, all of a sudden the Turkic mercenaries on the side of the Byzantines was now. So that order of battle suddenly switched. One thing started to go in favor of the Seljuks. And of course, Russell de Bayou didn't want to fight. He said, no, we marched all this way, but we're going to sit this one out. Because they were kind of reading this might be a bad idea. And I mean, his forces were heavy cavalry. You know, in essence, he was the big guns. Even though he didn't have a lot of troops, he had a lot of big, heavy armored troops. And of course, the son to the rival was leading up the rear guard. Bad. Real bad. And so, as soon as the first sign of things going south happened, Ducas fled the battle with his troops, went to Constantinople and said, Romanos IV is dead! Long live my dad is the king! It wasn't quite that, simple, but basically it in essence went home and led a coup. Is more or less what happened. And of course, messengers only travel as fast as horse, and nobody else was left, so he had them. So this was an absolute strategic disaster for the Byzantines. Now, there are some reports, it's sometimes referred to as a massacre, that everybody was wiped out. Truth is, a lot of people survived this battle, but, and in fact, there were certainly casualties, but they were certainly not wiped out to a person. But this was a huge strategic disaster for the Byzantines, because Romanos IV himself was captured and actually brought before Alp Arslan. Alp Arslan didn't believe that the person that was brought before him was the actual emperor, because he had been so badly beat up and bloody. But he asked him, are you the emperor? And to which Romanos IV said yes. And so he did what's called a ritual of humiliation. He put his boot on Romanos IV's neck, said, "Kiss the ground," which he did. He said, "All right, get up, let's go have a feast." And he treated him really well. And over this feast, they cleaned him up. And over this feast, the thing is, the Turks had this reputation of being mean, and they weren't. They were actually really nice to this guy. And so, basically, Arslan had said before the battle, this is what I would like. And so his conditions didn't really change. He said, okay. He basically said, now, Romanos IV was basically forced to cede the cities of Edessa, Manzikert, Hierapolis, and Antioch. Pay $1.5 million in gold, plus $360,000 a year in a tribute. Currency of the day, I would have, but basically, it was sometimes referred to as gold pieces, but unless you play Dungeons and Dragons, it doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Anyway, it was a lot, in the currency of the day, it was a lot of money. And also, that not only that, my son will marry your daughter, marriage alliance, and that we would actually leave the interior of Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, the interior of it, just as a no man's land. So, not yours, not mine, but in essence, as a buffer territory. And the reality is the Byzantines could no longer realistically defend it anyway. So, Romanos IV himself was then sent on his way with an escort, a guard, and an entourage. It has been said that really, the only thing that Romanos IV himself lost in terms of the battle was his baggage train. But he got one complete with an escort and was returned back to Constantinople. The trouble is that when he got back to Constantinople, he discovered that in fact he had effectively been overthrown. He did attempt to reclaim the throne briefly, but then he was overthrown again. He was blinded physically, a la King Lear. Yuck. And then exiled, and then died of an infection from the blinding. In other words, the Turks treated him a whole lot better than the Byzantines did when they got home. Good question. That I genuinely don't know. I would have to look that up. So, coming back to Russell de Bayeux, and it was he was either a Frank or a Norman. He had definitely a French French name. He refused to join the battle, but the Byzantines kept him on the payroll. Dumb idea. Because then now granted, it wasn't Romanos IV who sent them in. It was basically, I think perhaps because he had sat out the battle, that Dukas and those who had overthrown Romanos IV looked on him with favor. And then they said, okay, well, you know what? That territory in the middle of Asia Minor that they agreed that nobody would take, okay, you go take those fortresses. And so he went, de Bayeux went in with 3,000 cavalry to shore up those defenses in the area that of course, Arslan had said, no, we're leaving that open and vacant. The hitch is that de Bayeux said he didn't capture them on behalf of the Byzantines. He said, I want my own kingdom. And he captured Ankara and took territory around it, basically set up his own independent state. Now remember earlier I was pointing to the kingdom of Sicily? That was under Norman control for similar reasons. And de Bayeux wanted to do the same thing in central Turkey. So the Normans had England, and they had southern Italy, and now a place in central Turkey. But of course, the Byzantines weren't happy about this at all, so they made a deal with the next sultan to actually take out the Normans for them. And so you actually have a Christian state making a deal with an Islamic state to take out a Christian state. Anybody confused by this? Okay. Good. Remember, Byzantine politics. But what happened is because the Byzantine Empire wasn't able, the Byzantines at the time were not able to take a territory back from the Normans at that point in time. They actually got the Seljuk Turks to do it. But the Seljuk Turks, of course, kept the territory. They didn't see, and so as a result, more and more of the territory in Anatolia, what is Asia Minor, fell into the hands of the Seljuk Turks. And that area, because truly the Seljuk Empire wasn't really interested in Asia Minor, they set up a sultanate of their own that had loyalty to the Seljuk Empire, but was actually an independent state. And that became the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome. And Rome is Rome. They perceived it as Roman. And that's how they understood, that's where that name comes from. In 1077. So again, this is about 18 years before the Crusades. So, this is what the territories looked like after all this was done. About 9 years after the Battle of Mansfield. Is that you still had the Byzantine Empire still controlled regions here, and Cyprus, as well as some interior territories there. Now, how do you suppose they get there? Well, it's kind of like they actually had reasonable diplomatic relations, kind of. So, that they were able to do this. But after all this, the Byzantine Empire, the Battle of Manzikert is regarded as really when the decline of the Byzantine Empire was irreversible. It would still linger for another 400 years under some various form, but it would no longer have that kind of territory anymore. And this, of course, the eastern borders were now destabilized, and different groups, not just the Seljuk Turks, were able to establish footholds in various places. And they were constantly fighting against these were various Turkish groups, but also Normans. The Byzantine Empire, actually, for a lot of the history in and around this time, was actually in active warfare against the Normans. Remember that the kingdom of, and of course, internally, because of these losses, there was also internal strife going on. So the Byzantine Empire was weak. Now, going back, what the heck are we talking about the Normans here? Like, the Normans are, like, over there in England. Why are they here? Well, they were good mercenaries. But also in feudal Europe, land was everything. And the Normans were running out of land. So, in and around 1000, and I'm backing up a little bit, is that the Normans were basically hired as mercenaries to actually retake, initially, Sicily. And, but then also, because they're rather expansionist, to unify, to take the territories. And these purple territories here were actually under Byzantine control originally. Okay? So that kingdom of Italy, when we get back to that, that picture, is the Normans actually had a fairly long history of fighting against the Byzantines. And yet the Byzantines, of course, being the political animals that they were, would often hire them anyway. I don't know why, but they did. And of course, at the time, they wanted to make the empire great again. A lot of stupid decisions under that phrase. That under Alexios I decided to wanted to try and regain a lot of the territories that they had lost, because the thing is, they had suffered what they perceived many humiliations since the battle of, especially under the Battle of Massacre. Never mind that the Battle of Massacre was entirely the fault of the Byzantines. The Turks simply just took advantage of it. And so he wanted to bolster his forces, and of course, keep in mind, this is a couple generations after Rosso de Bayeux, because that whole by 1073, the Seljuk Turks had wiped out the Normans on behalf of the Byzantines and had reclaimed that territory. So people not remembering things that happened like not quite 20 years ago, that maybe doing, maybe hiring Western mercenaries wasn't such a good idea. Well, Alexios the First had seen and was impressed with mercenaries from the West and said, I'd like to hire some, because I want to regain territories in and around Turkey. Now notice I haven't mentioned Jerusalem at all. Okay? When am I going to mention Jerusalem? Eventually. Now I'm just keeping an eye on the time, because we're almost at the 2-hour mark here. So he wanted to hire Western mercenaries specifically to come and help him reclaim Asia Minor. That's it. That's all he wanted. I want to hire some mercenaries, but I don't know. It's such a pain to send people individually to Northern England, to the Holy Roman Empire. You know what? In terms of communication, I'm just going to send delegations to the papacy in Rome, because they've got a great communication network. They should be able to scare us up some mercenaries. That was the thinking. As early as 1090, he started sending envoys to try and repair that relationship. And in 1095 is when he made a formal request to Pope Urban II in Rome to procure specifically mercenary forces to help him reclaim Asia Minor. And that's for next week. Any questions before, as we wrap up? Funny. Yeah. Well, keep in mind, Turkey's not indefinite. And so that didn't really come to play so much. Bonnie's question was in terms of different forces, how would like heavily armored knights? Yeah, like heavy knights on big horses. Now the thing is, there is a certain amount. Like the reality is that there were heavy cavalry equivalents that were horse rider equivalents within the Seljuk. They were often referred to as Mamluks. And many of them, that was almost the equivalent of a knight. So there were forces similar, but of course, stuff that is designed for European, Northern European combat versus what you might experience, say, in the Mediterranean might be a little bit different.
Different techniques they used.
Yes, and there were certainly different techniques. For example, we don't get into it, but the longbow, for example, was a uniquely British or England northern thing. But bows were universal. And sometimes, like composite bows, on the other hand, were not a Northern European thing. They were more of that was more of an Eastern thing. We do get a little bit into weaponry, but not as much. My focus primarily is in terms of events and politics. But we might get a little bit into that. But if there are specific questions about military techniques that were used, email me for those and let me know, because I'd be pleased to try and answer that. So anyway, thank you for the first night. Oh, Don. Oh, right. For those of you not familiar with I am using historian's practice. AD stands for Anno Domini, Year of the Lord. CE stands for Common Era. They mean the same thing. Okay. But the primary reason is historians tend to use Common Era because the reality is that Anno Domini is supposedly after the birth of Jesus. The trouble is that the birth of Jesus could be anywhere from 4 BC to 8 BC. And we're not actually sure. And so 0 is actually almost, well, 1, there is no 0. It went from, 1 BC to 180, I mean, if you want to do it that way. And so as a result, CE becomes more of it using the Common Era designation, not so much to be politically correct, although I would argue, Dad would probably argue with that
Very much.
a little bit. But it is, if you're looking in terms of in terms of practice amongst historians, using the term CE has been fairly common in scholarly circles for a while. But anytime you just, like, that's one of the reasons why, if you look back and I do dating, I actually am leaving the CE and the AD off. Fill in what you like. But this is approximately that AD, CE, same thing. Kind of. If you're in Western Europe, it is absolutely Anno Domini. If you're not, it's not. But it's conventional understanding. But anyway. Any other questions? So we do the First Crusade next week. And just as a hint, it was actually the only really successful one.
How are you? Good. Oh. that.